Hey everyone, hope you're all good today. It seems like it's a crazy day in my neighborhood today, so I'm just apologizing in advance for noise and like the neighbors' dogs barking and stuff like that. I'm gonna see what I can cut out. I'm gonna try and limit the noise and disruption as much as possible, but I am saying sorry in advance. So I see that a lot of people are talking about the Dateline documentary that came out a few days ago about Idaho 4, rightfully so. And if you haven't seen it, look, my first choice would be to actually watch the whole thing. So I'll put a link to CJ's Twitch channel where you can go and watch the watch parties that he had. You can watch either or both. I'd recommend watching both because there's different stuff in them. But for those of you who've already seen it and want a little bit more of an analysis, or if you, for whatever reason you don't want to watch it, I am here for you because that's what we're going to go through right now. Because I want to do it a little bit in depth, I'm not going to cover everything in one video. What I'm going to try and do is just go through the whole beginning of the episode, and then I'll stop right as they're getting into the timeline of events on the actual day of the crime, and then I'll pick that up from a part two. And hopefully, it'll just be two videos, but maybe it'll be three. We'll see how it goes because I do kind of have a lot to say. I didn't mean to have a lot to say, but it looks like I do. Um, just looking at the amount of notes that I made. Okay, so let's get straight into it. I'm going to quote something from very early in the documentary that they said pretty much in the beginning, because I thought that was really important because that kind of explains how they're able to bring you all of this that is in this episode of Dateline. So it says, in the 2 years since our last report, we have learned things, heard things, and seen things that have never before been reported. We've gathered this information carefully and methodically from sources with direct knowledge of the evidence, sources we trust. So that's interesting, right? Because I mean, this is a case under gag order. A lot of people have had that question like, how is this even possible? How is this even fair? Is this actually ethical? Is this going to affect things when it comes to trial? And what is the agenda here? And I think that those are all really fair questions, especially if you're looking at this like sources close to the investigation, how close, who, why, there's a lot to be asked about that already, and we haven't even really started yet. But early on, they say that these sources close to the investigation apparently think that Maddie was the target of the whole attack, and that's something that they bring in very early. And then they kind of leave it there a little bit because they say that this is the opinion of investigators, but then instead of explaining why investigators think this, they ask this lady, Angela Nevejas, who is the mother of Ashlyn Couch, a close friend of Maddie's. And when asked, why she thinks Maddie would be the target of this, her response is that Maddie was so beautiful. So I feel that this is strategic. They're sort of setting the stage for their favorite Brian Koberger couldn't get women narrative, which may or may not be true. I think that it's still quite baseless and very oversimplified, in my opinion. But then the same lady, Angela, talks about how the victims were all really responsible, which I don't know, maybe they were. But I think that all parents want to believe that. I don't exactly have a comment. But then they bring in this person, Katie Whitmire, who used to be an employer of Maddie's at a clothing store. And she says that she knew all the roommates and she gave them modeling and other work at fashion related events. And she tried to offer Maddie more hours in this work, but Maddie declined. And this seems to really confuse Katie, who says that she would have offered her more money to stay, but then she doesn't get into a lot of detail about why, because it seems like Maddie still declined. So I'd be quite curious to know why Maddie didn't accept more money to stay. Like maybe there was something else wrong with the job or something else that she didn't like. After that, they introduce Brian Koberger a bit, and they make it very clear that he had a lot of social difficulty and poor self-image as a child. The placement of this is clearly to further contrast Brian Koberger against the victims, who were obviously beautiful and popular, and we've heard that they were responsible. I think the wording used was rays of sunshine, who were sought after in industries such as fashion. So, stark contrast. I mean, I'm not saying that any of that isn't true about them. I think it probably is more or less true. But I did want to point out how they really want you to see that contrast right off the bat. Otherwise, it will disturb the very important message that they have for you. All right, then we have my personal hero, Howard Blum. And I struggled to get a screenshot of him with his eyes properly open, so I'm quite proud of this one. They say that Howard Blum has studied Brian Koberger intensely, which is good news, I guess. I don't know. So Blum introduces this idea of a transformed Brian Koberger, who's turned his life around and found a calling in criminology, and is now starting this PhD at Pullman. We also get to hear from Dr. Gary Bricado. This is just still part of the intro, but they kind of let you know that they are going to be talking about pictures of women on Brian Koberger's phone. And that's interesting because they have this in the intro, and it just kind of shows you that Dateline seems to have some kind of a copy of Brian Koberger's phone. So the sources close to the investigation are very generous people, and I do find that strange. But Dr. Mercado says that these photos are a clear indication of Brian Koberger's trolling behavior, and they're depicting people in Brian Koberger's mind that fuel a specific fantasy for him. Now, which I mean, I get that. I understand what he's trying to say. It's not that complicated. But I also think that you need more than a person's phone to be able to get into their head to that extent. I think it's a little bit irresponsible. But you know what? That's just my opinion, and they will get into it in a little bit more depth. Like I said, this is actually just part of the intro. But then, we get into the documentary properly, and we hear that Brian Koberger arrived in Pullman on the 30th of June, and there's a photo that he took from the parking lot on the same day. Now, we move on to the pool party story. And this has caused quite a stir, I've seen. Brian Koberger was invited by a neighbor to a pool party. Most people arrived at this pool party around 2 or 3 o'clock. There was a guy called Baseth Salamjan who briefly talked to Brian Koberger, but they had nothing in common, so they didn't really talk anymore. Brian Koberger also talked to the DJ. It seems like he was irritating the DJ a bit, and he eventually had to ask Brian Koberger for some space. I kind of get that. It can be annoying when you're trying to work, but I don't know. Maybe it's a little rude as well to be like, just give me space. I don't know. I don't really know what happened. But what's important is that they now bring in Holly. She met Brian Koberger and they started chatting because she felt obligated to talk to him. She was so obligated to talk to him that she told him about a hiking group that she's a part of, and they exchanged numbers. And guys, Dateline words this phone number exchange like it was some kind of a near death experience for her. But she managed to survive the ordeal and she texted Brian Koberger her name. Brian Koberger also exchanged details with another woman. This made Baseth Salamjan, jealous, but he also survived. Let's just bear that in mind. And then Brian Koberger became fixated on two girls in bikinis, because that's actually what you wear to a pool party, for those of you who didn't know. And apparently he was harassing them, even though one of them had a husband present. Now, what's most interesting about this is that Dateline doesn't really have a proper source for this harassment. It was observed by a party guest and then relayed by, you guessed it, a source close to the investigation. So it's pretty indirect. But Brian Koberger contacted Holly the following day. She said that the wording of his text was peculiar, even though it actually really wasn't. It wasn't. But listen to the audacity of this, guys. Brian Koberger said, "Hey, I'm pretty sure we spoke about hiking trips yesterday. I really enjoy that activity, so please let me know. Thanks." Now, she claims she didn't follow up with him. I'm not sure if I believe that, but let me not get into it. Um, I have a direct quote that I wrote down from what she said, just to highlight that at the end of what she said about him, she's also kind of overly formal. Listen, she said, "There's not really a good explanation. The universe intervened, and for whatever reason, something just distracted me from further engaging in that interaction." Now, I mean, I think that's just as formal as his text. But anyway, again, I'm not getting into it. We're not done with all of these people, though, because the DJ, who had originally asked Brian Koberger for some space, saw him at a hike at a later stage. Brian Koberger approached him and his hiking group, and Brian Koberger acted like they were good friends, but they didn't really know who he was. So let's just stop there for a minute and be honest. Like, however weirdly he might have acted at the pool party, it was actually pretty forgettable, is the bottom line. Unless this is something like the whole postgraduate group now clamoring to be like, "I don't know him. I hardly know him. I promise. I don't know." But This hiking group was on their way down the hill. It was getting dark. But Brian Koberger was on his way up the hill, alone in the dark. And they make it sound like he should have been arrested there and then for hiking in the dark. Like we have to get him on at least one count of post sunset incline infringement. I don't know what the problem is. And honestly, with the way they're highlighting this so much, all they're really doing is helping to confirm the habit evidence that he needs to build his alibi. Because for all we know, he was stargazing that night too. Okay, they note in this documentary that nighttime appealed to Brian Koberger. And then they bring my friend who says that Brian Koberger was somebody who lived in the shadows. He really said that. I feel like that might be the name of his next book, Lived in the Shadows. It's good, right? All right, but Blum acknowledges that it's not a crime to be a night owl, but he does add that this, contributes to Brian Koberger's sense of mystery and his persona, which is of somebody who's detached from society. Now, I get what he's trying to say. I get the fact that he's chosen to take this hike alone shows that he's not treating it as a social activity like the others are. But let's also be fair. He did try and join a hiking group. He tried to make it social, and it was Holly who didn't get back to him about it, right? He wasn't going to wait around to hear back on the hiking group. He wasn't hounding her to get back to him. He wasn't stalking the hiking group because they rejected him. He was literally just saying, okay, I didn't hear back. I guess I'll do it on my own. And since I'm doing it on my own, I'll do it at a time that suits me. I don't get the problem. And while we're at it, let's give him credit for remembering and greeting the group because these quite possibly might be people who weren't actually very friendly to him at the pool party. If the DJ asked him for space, then it's safe to say things probably didn't end very comfortably between them. But Brian Koberger remembered him and everyone else and greeted them before carrying out his night, which that sounds quite cordial. And this brings me to an important point that I want to bring up because for the people who say that Brian Koberger was so outraged that he couldn't be with somebody as beautiful as Maddie and he needed to do this crime because of that, we need to bear this in mind. This is a guy who was zip tied by a SWAT team and still asked a member of that SWAT team for coffee shortly after. Holly ignored him, but she never heard from him again. She never saw him again. The DJ asked him for space at the party, but he still remembered that person and greeted him while walking up a hill. So I don't feel that he's the kind of person who has this huge capacity to bear a grudge against people who've wronged him, and he harbors this kind of anger when he's feeling socially rejected. I think that if he committed this crime, there's really going to have to be a better reason than Maddie was pretty. Okay? I'm sorry, but no. But moving on. They do acknowledge that OCD can impact sleep cycles. I'd like to point out as well, just while we're on that it can also cause you to obsessively clear your internet search history. That's kind of similar to the impulse to clean. It's like digital cleaning, okay? Then they introduce this Greg Cooper, who I think is some kind of profiler. And he says that Brian Koberger functions under the cloak of darkness because he doesn't want to be identified. And I've kind of already talked about all that, so I'm not going to get into it much more. They say that he made trips to Moscow starting the night of the pool party. I feel that this might strengthen the claim that he was there for hiking because he just heard about it that day. So maybe he was looking for some kind of a hiking trail. I don't really know. But Blum confirms that he had no prior interactions with the victims. And Cooper says that this all somehow shows a plan was coming together. I feel that we don't really know enough to say that yet. But since they seem to have his phone, they also let us know that he Googled Ted Bundy and the name of a professor of his, and he downloaded a paper called Ted Bundy on the Malignant Being. I went and downloaded the same paper today. I didn't read it in depth, I just managed to skim it, but it is pretty hectic. I think you do need to be a criminologist to understand and find that interesting. But there are some things in there that could maybe explain some of the illicit content searches that will come up later. That kind of thing was sort of mentioned in the paper, so it could have been in line with that kind of thinking and that kind of research. But Cooper explains that Brian Koberger was looking up things that he aspires to. And he said that he wishes that Brian Koberger could reach that level of power domination and control in his own life. Self explanatory. I don't know what to say to that. Dateline notes that the King Road house was very busy, and they wonder if Brian Koberger could have snuck in at some point, and they put this idea to Angela, who says no. And she says no quite emphatically. She says that somebody of his age would have been thrown out. He wouldn't have been welcome at a party. Then she says something kind of interesting. She says that her and her husband watched that firsthand. So, how do you see that firsthand if you're not actually there? And if you were ever there, it's not about age because it can't be like, no, you're not allowed in if you're 27, but if you're 47, it's fine. It wouldn't have been about age. So unless there's some kind of footage of them throwing out old people, I don't understand, and that would be weird. But they go on to mention the illicit content searches of Brian Koberger. They don't say if he spent time watching anything after the searches or if he was reading up on it. And I think in order to make a decision on what I think about that, I'd really like to know. But Cooper says that, he says the same thing again. It's something about power domination and control. Then they bring out Blum again, who talks about how Brian Koberger became a teaching assistant and always thought that he was the smartest person in the room. Now, I don't know, maybe he was the smartest person in the room. He was the teaching assistant among a whole lot of students. I'm not sure if maybe he didn't handle that very well. I can't say. Then they have Katie again, who says that Brian Koberger was known to have a problem with women. They say that he enjoyed belittling a professor of his about her English usage, and it's the same woman who wrote the paper that I downloaded this morning. Her English seemed fine to me in the paper. I don't know. I mean, I don't even know what to say about that. There's not much information. But then they move on to talk about Na Young Ko. Now, this is somebody who shared an office and apartment building with Brian Koberger and apparently had a thing for him. And apparently he wasn't interested in her. So, I mean, that is kind of interesting. But they also note that while he was in the process of rejecting this Nayonko, he had pictures of girls on his phone, and some of them were people who knew the victims. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys, I don't like that. I really don't. I find it a bit weird, but I also don't think it's that relevant to the crime. I just think it's weird, like in its own right. And a lot of people have come out and said, well, he's a guy. It's normal. I don't know what guys have on their phones, but people are saying it's normal. But Dr. Piccardo says that this is trolling behavior and, it serves Brian Koberger's fantasy and it relates to the type of person who has regularly rejected him. They also talk about how history shows how potential serial killers progress and they engage in escalating behaviors like window peeping, entering uninvited, and collecting of personal items. Then they detail this incident of Nai Young Ko's, the story from the 10th of September that a lot of us have heard about already. But Blum tells us about how this lady felt that there had been a break in at her home and cakes and makeups were moving around and a watch and a personal letter were missing. So she pulled a Dylan Mortensen and didn't call 911. She called Brian Koberger. It was 2 a.m. and she spent the night at Brian Koberger's place. But, she later feels suspicious because Brian Koberger knew about the letter and the watch. I'm not even sure how that usually comes up in a conversation, but she'd obviously told him about these personal items. She also remembered that a key to her apartment that she kept in her office had gone missing the day before and reappeared after she asked Brian Koberger about it. Now, this is all really going to speak to how many people had access to the office and like how many people knew where things were kept and all that. It's really hard to comment. But Brian Koberger helped her install a new surveillance and security system. She later wondered if he could use that to watch her. The thing is, guys, like if Brian Koberger wanted some kind of access to this woman, it would have been so much easier for him to just accept her earlier romantic advances. Like she probably would have let him in and he wouldn't have needed to steal keys and relocate cakes and stuff to get in. So I'm compelled to ask, like, how offended was she that he didn't like her back? Because that is going to factor into how serious this is. But they go on to say that Brian Koberger was having issues at work and he was having to meet with the dean. Now, I don't know a lot about it, but if Brian Koberger is autistic and he was having issues related to odd behavior and temper and whatever, then maybe that department needs to implement some kind of detection and support for staff with disabilities. This might actually be a good time to look into that. Like I said, I'm not, taking a dig at them. I don't really know. But on the 30th of September, Brian Koberger Googled sociopathic traits in college students. Now, Dr. Bricado implies that Brian Koberger could be starting to notice that he has problems with feelings and wants to look up, what might be wrong with him or something like that. Again, we don't know. We don't know what was and wasn't for work. We don't know what was and wasn't for school. They talk about how Brian Koberger could have been using social media to gather intel on the victims and the house, which is interesting because they're not shy to give dates and times of things from his phone for other things. Like they're pretty impressed with themselves about the fact that they have access to his phone. So where's the exact date and time of the search for this intel, right? I don't know. Okay, so they also note that cell records show he was still browsing pictures of local women in early October. Then they talk about these illicit content searches in his Google history. Again, they haven't said if he was doing it in a research kind of way or if he was browsing actual content, because that is still something that could be Bundy related, but I don't know a lot about it either. They talk about his traffic infringement and the female police officer, and a few days later he Googled, "Can psychopaths behave pro socially?" He also Googled his own name 4 times in 14 days. Blum explains that Brian Koberger was reported for having a confrontation with a female student. He made her feel uncomfortable while she was at her car. And apparently, Brian Koberger made 23 trips to the same area after dark, they say within 100 meters of the future crime scene. So again, there's been a lot of contention about that. A lot of people have had stuff to say about cell towers and how that actually works. Um, that's not new. Brian Koberger stopped using his debit card from the 10th of November. Dateline got that from a court document. It doesn't seem like the source close to the investigation told them that. But they also got from a court document that he started using anti-forensic methods to clear evidence from his school PC, on the 11th of November. As I said earlier, clearing of things can be an OCD thing. There's a number of reasons and all kinds of things that people can do that. But again, it would really need to be understood within context. Okay, so that's everything in the Dateline documentary leading up to the timeline that they present, which I'm going to make part 2 of this video. I hope that helped if you just wanted like a really quick summary. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day further. Bye.